All right. Shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I would like to give all praise, honor, glory to YAHAWAH, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone that taught us this truth. And salutations to the hopeful elect that's around the four corners of the globe. And the elect begins with the 144,000. Yahweh, who the world ignorantly calls God and Jehovah. BAHASHAM is in the name. YAHAWASHI, who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ. The Rakakwa doctrine is the Holy Spirit. I'm the brother I will lump you with the gym at Chicago camp out here in Chicago. Come back at you, brothers and sisters of the household of faith of the Hopeful Right Select with another lesson. And Lord willing, I hope this lesson be edifying through the spirit and power of YAHAWASHI. Once again, I hope this lesson is edifying. I'm just really going to do a lesson of how the fact that this ultimately what, the truth and the facts are coming out that, the so-called Negroes, who are the biblical Israelites, we ultimately ruled Europe for 1,000 years, man. Because when Esau got back into power, what was that during the 1300s? He came back into power. He ultimately destroyed the dark-skinned images. He recreated a lot of the dark-skinned images and ultimately turned them into so-called white men. And the brother, the elder brother Shati out here in the gym at Chicago, he ultimately take these expeditions over there to Europe, and he ultimately reveals or ultimately takes pictures, of the truth of those dark-skinned images over there in Europe. And a lot of those, said dark-skinned images they had, from the public. And ultimately, the elder brother out here in gym at Chicago, he ultimately he takes different pictures and he bring it back, to us, man, that we may, be able to behold these said things, man. But the scripture talks about it, man. In Job 9:24, hey, he covered the faces of the judges thereof, man. Because he's ultimately, these Edomites, beginning with the elites, they're trying to hide the fact that we ultimately ruled over them for 1,000 years, man. And with that, man, they're ultimately trying to, hide our heritage, man, that the fact that we're the Israelites, man. And ultimately by doing that, he's trying to cover up, a lot of our history, man. But in these last days, these said things are being revealed, man. What's that? Vladimir Putin, ultimately, was that going back a few months ago, ultimately revealed a lot of the dark-skinned images, the dark-skinned statues that were, that were over there that they had hidden in the vote. But these said things are ultimately, being made known, man, for the world to see. So I'm going to just, just swipe, just to ultimately to show, the dark-skinned images, the dark-skinned statues, which the brother ultimately took picture of us to bring back to us, man. So I'm going to do a little scrolling, as you can see, hey, Jake, and ultimately what, this lie has been going, on, for ages, that ultimately what you had, Esau Edom ultimately was ruling during the dark ages, man. But that's not the case, man. You had Jake all throughout Europe, ultimately ruling over Europe, man. The different castles you see in like France, Ireland, Britain, all those was created by Jake, man. Everything that you see over there in Europe, man, they was all created, by Jake, man. You had Judah, Benjamin, and Levi ultimately what, had control of Europe, man. So-called Europe. Jake was in possession of that, man. And ultimately what, and like I mentioned before, as Esau Edom got back into power, man, ultimately, he reclassified the images, man. He destroyed a lot of the images, and he ultimately what? He repainted, those said images to ultimately to look like so-called white men, man. So I'm gonna do a little bit of swiping, as you can see, dark-skinned images all over there in Europe today, man. And like I mentioned before, a lot of the the statues they broke the noses off of, man. They reclassified, restructured, a lot of the images, man, to make them look like so-called white men. And it's a lot more, man. But I'm just getting straight into the precepts, man. But ultimately, hey, the truth is being revealed, man. Let's start out with that 2nd Ezra 6. This is the book of 2nd Ezra 6 and verse 27. For evil shall be put out, and deceit shall be quenched. As for faith, it shall flourish. Corruption shall be overcome. And the truth which have been so long without fruit shall be declared. And by the way of this word, hey, ultimately what? This knowledge, wisdom, understanding that's being revealed. Ultimately, we're casting down these strongholds, these different lies that was put up. Ultimately what? It talks about, the Lord is going to destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast that spread upon all nations, man. And we're doing that by the way of the word, man. So what? The world is starting to realize who the true Israelites are. Hey, the world is starting to realize that ultimately Jake, You know what's the ones that ruled, Europe during the Dark Ages, man? That 1,000-year period. The Byzantine Empire, man. Jake ultimately ruled. Ultimately what? Esau Edom was under our authority, man. Esau Edom was ultimately what? They were cavemen. The wild men. Let's read that last part again. Verse 28 says, as for faith, it shall flourish, corruption shall be overcome, and the truth which hath been so long without fruit shall be declared. And ultimately what? This truth has been sealed up for ages, man. And with us ultimately proclaiming this knowledge, wisdom, understanding, man, ultimately what? The truth is being revealed throughout the four corners of the world, man. Everything is being revealed by the way of this word, man. Ultimately what? The Lord raising up his men to ultimately what? Declare the truth by the way of this word, man. And with us declaring this word, throughout the four corners of the world, ultimately what? These, different strongholds are being destroyed, man. Let's actually grab that in Job 9:24 real quick. This, the book of Job 9:24 says, the earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covereth the faces of the judges thereof. If not, where and who is he? Right. The earth is given into the hands of the wicked. And who is the wicked, man? You got three classifications of men. You have the sons of God, which are the Israelites. You have the sons of men, which are the other nations. You have the sons of the wicked, which is Esau Edom, man. The self-proclaimed white man, beginning with these elites, man, beginning with the Amalekites, which is the chief tribe of Edom, man. Ultimately, the whole earth is in their control because YAHAWASHI has given it to him, man. And I wanted to get to this part right here. It says, if he covered the faces of the judges thereof, if not, wherein who is he? And ultimately, when Esau Edom came back into power, you had an era called what? The Renaissance period, which means what? Rebirth. So when Esau Edom began to come back into power, what's that? To the mid to late 1300s. Ultimately what? He ultimately got control of Europe. Ultimately because prophecy had to play out, and ultimately, well, what? Esau Edom coming back into power, he ultimately destroyed a lot of the dark-skinned images and the dark-skinned statues that was over there in Europe, man. And a lot he also hid. He ultimately proclaimed himself as what? As the Messiah. He proclaimed himself as the prophets, man. And ultimately the biggest form, form of identity theft, ultimately changing who the world will ignorantly call Jesus Christ. His name is YAHAWASHI, ultimately changing him into a so-called white man. Ultimately what? They get the picture, what's that? Cedric Beaujeu. They painted him as the Lord and Savior, man, painted him as a so-called white man, man. But even throughout the scriptures, and ultimately the different statues that you see, it's evident that what? That the Lord is a dark-skinned man, that his people are dark-skinned people, man. Because you got scriptures like what? What's that? It's Songs of Solomon. It says, my skin is black, and ultimately what? It says, what's that? Judith mourneth in the gates thereof language, they are blacker to the ground. You read Revelations 1, it talks about that, man. Hey, the color of our Messiah, man. Of our Messiah, man. YAHAWASHI. It describes him as a dark-skinned man. A so-called black man. So this is what this devil has done when he got back into power, man. He ultimately covered the faces of the judges thereof. Now he's proclaiming to be the prophets. Now he's proclaiming to be the Messiah, man. He's proclaiming to be the Israelites, But ultimately, as I read in that 2 Ezra 6, man, these said strongholds are being destroyed, man. And then ultimately began by the way of the word, man. This is the book of Psalms 85:11. Truth shall spring out of the earth, and righteousness shall look down from heaven. Right, these different artifacts that's being discovered within the earth, man. It's ultimately a sign that what? That ultimately, with the Lord, doing these said things, man, it's ultimately exposing, Esau Edom for the liar that he is, man. He, proclaims himself to be these said people that you read throughout the Bible, but what? These said artifacts that's being discovered within the earth, man. Even the statues that's been hidden. The elder brother Shatia went over there to Europe to ultimately what? To take pictures to bring it back to us, man. That we may do videos just like this to ultimately what? To reveal these said things, man. For the public to see. And ultimately what? With these said things being revealed, it's ultimately exposing Esau Edom for the liar that he is, man. So ultimately these said things are being revealed. Hey, ultimately, I had mentioned, even what's that? Vladimir Putin, the prime minister of Russia, he ultimately revealed a lot of these artifacts, that he ultimately really had been going back a couple of months ago, man. Showing, YAHAWASHI, his mother Mary, ultimately what? Depicted as dark-skinned individuals, man. So these said things are being revealed in our time, man. You know, it's ultimately is a sign that Esau Edom is going down, man, with these said things being revealed. You know? Because ultimately during that time, because it ultimately compelled me to look up iconoclasm, man. Because ultimately, as I mentioned, when Esau Edom got back into power during the 1300s, man, mid to late 1300s, what did he do? He restructured, you know, destroyed, and ultimately hid a lot of the dark-skinned images, man. And it says the word for iconoclasm, I'm just basically putting an iconoclasm definition. Iconoclasm means the deliberate destruction, removal, or rejection of religious images, sacred monuments, and cultural symbols, usually due to religious or political opposition. And ultimately, you know, when Esau Edom got back into power, what he did was, you know, he destroyed a lot of the dark-skinned statues, the dark-skinned images, you know, broke the nose off a lot of the statues, man, hit a lot of the statues and images of Jake, to ultimately proclaim himself up as, you know, our people, man. You know, for an example, Beethoven, you know, you have Mozart, you know, you have King James. All these are so-called black men. But ultimately, what did he do? He, you know, ultimately what? He came in, you know, iconoclasm. He ultimately what? Redesigned the images, you know, whitewashed the images, because that's what essentially what happened when Esau Edom got back into power. He whitewashed the images, man. He recreated the said images of Jake, and ultimately what? Depicted them as so-called white men, man. You know, that's what happened. You know, you had a term called what? The Renaissance period, which means rebirth. And what? During that time is ultimately when Esau Edom came back into power, man. You know? Let's actually grab that in Malachi. This is the book of Malachi 1:4. Whereas Edom said, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Right, and that happened during the Renaissance period, man. The mid to late 1300s, when Esau Edom got back into power. You know, ultimately, as I look into that word iconoclasm, well, ultimately, what did this devil do? He ultimately recreated a lot of the images, you know, painting them into so-called white men, you know, ultimately hiding a lot of dark-skinned images, you know, that depicted Jake on it, man. You know, ultimately had them in secret areas that, you know, it's hard to get to. And this is what Esau Edom did when he got back into power, man. You know, the revival of Rome. It says, whereas Edom said, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith Yahawah of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom Yahawah have indignation forever, man. And exactly right, man. If you read Isaiah 34, man, it talks about, you know, basically the Lord, well, I'm gonna grab it, but ultimately, you know, the Lord is gonna, you know, drop those missiles upon Idumea, man. You know, what's that? The people might curse the judgment. You know, ultimately what? The Lord is going to destroy this man's kingdom, man. You know, because it ultimately, you know, began with what? You know, us exposing this devil by the way of the word, man. And with us exposing this devil by the way of the word, you know, a lot of, you know, other truths began to be exposed, lies began to be exposed too, man. You know, for what this devil has done, man. Hey, ultimately what? You know, who was the true rulers of Europe during that 1,000-year period, man? Hey, Jake. You know, who was the true people of YAHAWASHI, YAHAWASHI, man? Hey, you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. And with us preaching this word, these said strongholds are ultimately what? Being, you know, being brought down by the way of the word, man. That's actually grabbed in that in First Maccabees, because when this devil got back into power, they ultimately, you know, depicted themselves as those same individuals that you read throughout the scriptures. You know, our Messiah, you know, Yahawashi, hey, the Israelites, they depicted them as so-called white men. King David, you know, as I read in that Job 9:24, he covered the faces of the judges thereof, man. First Maccabees 3:48, it says, and lay open the book of the law, wherein the heathen had sought to paint the likeness of their images. And exactly right, man. When Esau Edom got back into power during the Renaissance period, he did exactly that, man. Depicted himself up, what? As the Messiah, you know, as who the world will ignorantly calls God, Yahawah. You know, you had that blasphemous picture of, you know, of God and Adam touching fingers, man. You know, and ultimately, what? Our, you know, our God doesn't look like that, man. Yahawah doesn't look like that, man. You know, Yahawashi doesn't look like that. You know, they got, you know, Yahawah, they got JC, you know, ultimately depicted as a so-called white man's true name is Yahawashi. You know, nothing but complete lies, man. But ultimately, with this word, we're breaking down those said strongholds, man. Let me see, can I actually grab that real quick? I believe it's Isaiah 25. I could be wrong. Yep. Isaiah 25 and 7, I'm going to close out with this one. Isaiah 25 and verse 7, it says, and he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people and the veil that is spread over all nations. Right, the Lord is casting down those lies. The Lord is destroying those lies by the way of the word, man. The Lord set up his man to what? To proclaim this word. And with us proclaiming this word, we're ultimately what? Destroying those said lies that was ultimately put up, upon the minds of the people for ages, man. And with us, proclaiming this word, we're breaking down those said strongholds, those lies, that was put, on the minds of the people, man. And ultimately, what? The truth is being revealed, as I read in that 2nd Ezra, the 6th chapter, man. The truth that has been so long without fruit shall be declared. And that's by the way of the word, man. And with us teaching this word, all the truths are being revealed, man. All the lies are being exposed. But just something, I wanted to get into through the spirit. Lord willing, I hope this lesson is edifying. I want to end up giving all praise, honor, and glory to YAHAWAH, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, BAHASHAM, HaKakwadash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone that taught us his truth. And salutations to the hopeful elect that's around the four corners of the globe. Lord willing, I hope this lesson was edifying. Till next time, Kwam Yasharallah, Shalom, and the Baba Ball. Until next time, Lord willing.